Hello, and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Suzanne.
And I'm Michael.
And lately, I've been reading Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking.
And I've been reading Red X by David Demchuk.
So listeners, please get yourself a comfy drink, pull up a seat, and join us for a conversation about these books and more here at the Spouter-Inn. So, everybody will have noticed that was not Chris saying the opening words.
No, we have very different cadences in our voice.
Yeah, as we mentioned last time, Chris is taking a little bit of a sabbatical, and so Michael and I are taking the opportunity to spend some time in conversation.
Yeah.
And so welcome.
Thank you so much. Longtime listeners of the show might have remembered that I was on for a guest bonus episode about Middlemarch several years ago.
That was wonderful.
I mean, it's one of my most beloved novels of all time. So that tells you a little something about me, I suppose, and my tastes. But also, sneakily, every time you hear the theme music, I'm the bass voices. Because I've been lurking around Megaphonic since the start. I like to call myself the Megaphonic intern. I've hosted a few shows over the years. I've even guest edited a few episodes of the Spouter-Inn. When Chris has gotten a little too busy, I just hop in the editor's chair. So even if you've never noticed me, I've been around.
We always count on you as the first listener, I think, right? To give impressions of whether something worked or didn't work well.
It's a role that I'm both proud and delighted to fulfill because I get to hear it before anyone else.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy to be doing this together this summer.
Yeah.
So, Michael, one of the things that's really fun when Chris and I talk together is we have kind of a long history with some of the books that we're reading individually and also together. And it's always interesting to see how those intersect. What's your reading experiences? What do you bring to the conversation?
I met Chris when I was just starting my PhD in English literature more years ago than I like to think. And so I come to literature also through something of an academic background, but it's very different from Chris's and I suppose different from yours in that I wasn't a medievalist. I was a Canadianist, and specifically, I myself am physically older than any of the books that were in my dissertation. And so I was a longtime reader, and I kind of burnt out on it a little bit, I suppose. It's a common enough story. I've heard people who did PhDs, whether they successfully completed them or, like myself, they kind of wandered away when they were ABD with a half-finished thesis when they realized that the academic life wasn't what they necessarily wanted to pursue. And it was really difficult to get back to reading. There's a lot of scar tissue there. And then something about the pandemic sort of exacerbated that. And so one of the things I'm really excited about in my brief tenure here as Chris's guest host for a few months is this will sort of give me an obligation to read something, because I respond very well to external obligation.
Yeah, a friendly obligation.
Absolutely, a friendly obligation. I really love reading, and I love all the great things that reading a wide swath of literature does for you in terms of exposing you to ideas and viewpoints. And I tend to be a very emotional reader. I tend to just be an emotional sort of guy. So like the book that I'm reading this month, it brought me to tears a few times. That's a good thing. So in addition to sort of looking for brain food and to broaden my cultural horizons, I am looking for the empathetic adventure of reading a good novel that has some meat in that particular area.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think a lot of people share that experience of reading having become more difficult, in particular in the context of the pandemic, but I think also more broadly in the context of us being pushed into not just online reading, but online presence. It really changes our ability to pay attention, even in settings where we really love what we're doing. Like you said, you really love the experience of reading a novel, but it's harder than it has been before to really immerse yourself there.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I don't want to be cliche, but it's kind of the phone's fault.
Yeah, well, yeah, I know, right?
Like, you're immersed in a novel and you're like, wow, I've read 10 pages. I should check my Instagram account. And like, no.
Yeah, no, it's really challenging. And what you said about being an emotional reader too, I was really struck by that because one of the things that Chris and I have talked about at different times is the experience of, when you read a book, sometimes it's one that you've read before at another phase of life, and who you are, especially emotionally as a human being at those different times, really shapes your experience of reading.
Yeah.
And that's always been something really fascinating to bring out together.
Absolutely. I can remember having a very snobbish idea inculcated in me when I was younger, like early 20s and so forth. I was like, there are these difficult novels that you're not ready for yet. And you have to sort of become intellectually mature in order to truly appreciate.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say that there's nothing to that, but honestly, I think it was the fact that at 25, I had more miles under my tires than when I was 18. Mm-hmm. And that's why when I read Mrs. Dalloway for the second time, when I was 25, I was like, devastating, work of genius.
Yeah.
And when I was 18, I was like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
It wasn't intellectual, it was emotional maturity.
Yeah, and I seem to remember, even though it is a long time ago, when we were doing that bonus episode on Middlemarch, you talking about a little of that experience. That is the first reading and then the reading as it was changing as you changed, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's many people who can say they've read Middlemarch multiple times. It's a bit of an Everest, but I do feel like that is the sort of, like many rich literary texts, there's so many facets to that mirror that your position regards to the text, you'll see something different when you've moved to a new spot in life. So yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be wonderful reading together this summer.
I'm looking forward to it so much.
In the plastic bag I had been given at the hospital, there were a pair of corduroy pants, a wool shirt, a belt, and I think nothing else. I remember putting his cell phone and the charger on his desk. I remember putting his silver clip in the box in the bedroom in which we kept passports and birth certificates and proof of jury service. I remember combining the cash that had been in his pocket with the cash in my own bag, taking special care to interleaf 20s with 20s, 10s with 10s, 5s and 1s with 5s and 1s. I remember thinking as I did this that he would see that I was handling things. So Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking is a book that I've kind of known about for a long time, but only read very recently. Have you ever encountered any of her work?
By reputation.
Because she's kind of famous, right? In his general kind of way, right?
Oh, she's super famous. Super famous as a writer and I guess a public intellectual or just a sort of cultural touchstone. I'm actually sadly underread when it comes to American literature, but I know Joan Didion is like a big deal. And I know the Year of Magical Thinking is about death, and that's probably the extent of it.
Yeah, and I've kind of like always known about her. Occasionally I'd read like a little short piece by her, a little journalism piece here and there, but actually never read any of her books, even though I kind of knew about them. And then I finally picked this up, which is a really interesting experience. Maybe I could start by just giving a little bit of background to Joan Didion and the Year of Magical Thinking in particular.
Sounds great.
As we get started. So Joan Didion was a journalist, as I've mentioned, and a writer of novels and maybe even more famously, nonfiction. And I am a huge nonfiction lover, as listeners to the podcast will know. So it's kind of surprising I didn't read her before. Born in 1934, she passed away almost 5 years ago in 2021. She wrote for many magazines, Vogue, Esquire, The New Yorker, all the big boys. She got most famous through her two early nonfiction books, Slouching Toward Bethlehem, which came out in 1968, and The White Album, which came out a decade later in 1979. And these books were in large measure based on journal articles that she published earlier. And they were read widely. Some people loved them, some people kind of hated them. But what's interesting about her work, I think, is the way that the journalism is situated. And by situated, I mean that the perspective of the individual person, the journalist, is always acknowledged. In the case of Slouching Towards Bethlehem and The White Album, we're clearly situated, along with the author, in California. And the point of view that we see from is as much the subject of the book as the world events that are narrated in it. And some people see this as boring and narcissistic, but I also find it very interesting, this idea that you're never in a neutral spot. And that's, I think, one of her big contributions. The other interesting thing about Joan Didion is the way she writes, the texture of her prose, which I think is very, very beautiful. And reading this book really made me appreciate that. And maybe we'll talk about that later when we read a few passages. So I haven't been reading either of her early works that I said were the more famous ones, Slouching Towards Bethlehem and The White Album, but instead a late book by Didion that was published in 2005 called The Year of Magical Thinking. And she wrote this book, she tells us, in this very specific short period of time between October 4th and December 31st, 2004. And so she finished the book on the last day of the year, exactly a year and a day after the sudden death of her husband, John Gregory Dunn, who's also a journalist and writer. And that's what the book is about. It's about the illness of her daughter, the sudden death of her husband, and what happens to you, or more exactly, what happened to Joan Didion when everything falls apart. And it's kind of an odd book in terms of its shape. It seems to not even have a form. It narrates this year of magical thinking, and it's like one big container of the year, and it's divided into 22 chapters. And they move chronologically, but they're not so much carefully tracking the actual year after the death of her husband as chronicling that period of writing between October 4th and December 31st. So the book kind of feels almost diary-like in certain ways, though it's layered in a very subtle way where you see echoes of one passage show up at an early point and then again at a later point, in a way that diary entries don't really do. And the Year of Magical Thinking definitely hit a nerve with readers. It won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, and it was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Pulitzer Prize. And I understand that later on she adapted the book actually as a play, which is kind of hard to imagine, but it was indeed performed on Broadway in 2007. And you know, like I said, I've known about her work for a long time and was always thought, I should read some of her things. And I finally picked up The Year of Magical Thinking, and I don't even know what made me do it, what made me choose it for today. Maybe it's like a feeling that things are changing. And so I was looking for a book that would help me not just think that through, but kind of feel that through.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, sorry, that was a lot, but I just wanted to give a sense of my response to it. And I was kind of aware as I was choosing it out that it's kind of an odd choice, right? Because it's something I think, if not everyone, most everyone can identify with, like having gone through an experience of grief. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the question I've been chewing on in my brain in preparation for reaching the point when I would ask a question, and I'm chewing on it because I want to make sure that I ask it in a proper way. I guess most of us, unless we're very, very unlucky or lucky, have to deal with loss and grief, and I don't want to or require you to go into your own personal life here, but did you feel that this book sort of spoke to your own experiences in that near universal province of human experience?
Yeah. No, I mean, I have no boundaries. I have no problem talking about this. But yeah. And one of the things, like I said, I was struck by is that grief comes in so many different kinds of forms. I mean, she's talking here about the grief of a sudden death of her life partner, and also bound up with that, the concurrent, really severe illness of their daughter. And so the grief is in part centered around her daughter and her daughter's suffering and experience of illness, but very much centered around this loss of the husband.
Yeah.
And so I haven't been through that kind of loss, but I had a very bad year in 1998 when my very beloved grandmother died in April, and she was very old, right? So it wasn't unexpected, but I felt it quite a bit. And then my dad died really suddenly that fall in November, and so it was like one thing after another, kind of. And so there are certain passages in this book that I really I recognize some of the things she talks about, like. I don't think I went through an experience like what she's had, but this idea of waves of grief where you're suddenly physically shook by something that you're not even intellectually conscious of in the moment, that very much resonates with me. And what was also in my mind is that grief comes, at the loss of people or beloved companions. It could be an animal companion, right? Mm-hmm. But also, and I don't know if this is something that you've ever experienced, I have, the end of a relationship where it breaks and you've been able to not paper it over, but to keep going for a really, really long time. And then you have to acknowledge that that's not there. And that also, I very much was, for me, it's like a bodily grief experience.
Yeah. I mean, it's compartmentalization, it's a thing that people do. I consider myself to be very good at it. If something has happened and action needs to be taken, it's very good. You build the wall in your head, you put the grief and the emotions on one side, you take the actions, you do the things you do, and then once that's all done, you can let the wall down and then you fall apart. And I consider that both a good skill to have, but also kind of not necessarily great.
No, it's not really good for you, right?
It's not good for you. And well, I mean, like, I don't want to get too abstract in discussion of grief in a book that is about literal sudden death. But I mean, it feels to me like a large part of that is the shock of sort of having your face smashed into the fact that you are not in control of your life. You are not in control of what happens to you. The feeling that you ever wore was a comforting illusion. And, it is tempting to try and sort of cloak yourself in a new version of that illusion by sort of doing that compartmentalization trick and being like, okay, now I can take control. I can go into crisis mode and do these actions. I can make a list. I can check the things off the list. And that's just a self-soothing of sort of building back the illusion of control when life has just smacked you in the face with the fact that you are not in control of what happens to you.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And one of the things that I think is very interesting, in Joan Didion's book is she kind of illustrates for us the ways in which as human beings, we try to make sense of things. We try to make it intelligible. We try to make it work in some way. And so she's constantly throughout the book having recourse to all different frames of reference. It might be literature. It might be a documentary source of some kind, like an autopsy report or the front desk ledger in her building that tells her who exactly came, with the rescue squad. So she's always having recourse to like these intellectual kinds of means to make sense of things. And I found it really striking that in the whole book, she sort of explicitly addresses grief like as such early in the book and then quite late in the book. And it almost feels like bookends. I didn't realize it the first time I was reading it, but when I was rereading, I noticed it. And I was really struck by the ways in which when she's talking about grief as such, she's talking about like a bodily thing that happens to you, like, I don't know, like getting hit by a car. What I mean? It's like this physical thing that happens to your body. And the rationalization and the making sense that we were talking about just now kind of happens in between these two bookends. And so I'm going to read a couple words of where she describes this. This is from the passage early in the book. She says, "Grief, when it comes, is nothing we expect it to be. It was not what I felt when my parents died. My father died a few days short of his 85th birthday and my mother a month short of her 91st, both after some years of increasing debility. What I felt in each instance was sadness, loneliness, regret for times gone by, for things unsaid." And then she goes on about that for a while. And then she says this, "Grief is different. Grief has no distance. Grief comes in waves, paroxysms, sudden apprehensions that weaken the knees and blind the eyes and obliterate the dailiness of life. Virtually everyone who has ever experienced grief mentions this phenomenon of waves." And then she goes on and tells us at length, she quotes at length medical writing about this waves thing people do. So that kind of big picture of grief as like a thing that happens to you, and not just happens to you, but happens to your body, I thought was really interesting. And she comes back to it near the end, and now with a kind of emphasis on time. She says, "Grief turns out to be a place none of us know until we reach it. We anticipate. We know that someone close to us could die, but we do not look beyond the few days or weeks that immediately follow such an imagined death. We misconstrue the nature of even those few days or weeks. We might expect at the death is sudden to feel shock. We do not expect this shock to be obliterative, dislocating to both body and mind. We might expect that we'll be prostrate, inconsolable, crazy with loss. We do not expect to be literally crazy." And because that's what she's describing. She's describing, these things. She's doing these rituals. She's doing these things, and she acknowledges that with the belief that I just do it correctly, he will come back, like he will walk in the door.
Yeah,
and it's like uncanny when she narrates this because, like, she knows it's crazy.
do you know what flashed in my mind as you read that? I cannot explain why my brain makes such a connection, but I remember in Anne of Green Gables when Anne is staging her own funeral, and that sort of anticipatory of grief, and there's almost sort of adults are not children, although I guess they are. But there is something make-believe about it, even when you're trying to be very serious and you think about, oh, well, my husband could die, my child could die. How terrible, how awful, that anticipatory grief. But you don't expect it to actually make you crazy.
No.
You expect to be prostrate with grief, but that's still play acting when you're sort of anticipating it. And when it happens, oh no, it's not. It's absolutely, you are deranged.
Yeah. And it's really neat you make that connection to childhood experience, because one of the things she talks about, and I think this is a huge issue, is ritual. ritual, like
Yeah.
by which that includes like the ritual of the memorial service that she holds. And she describes in incredible detail, like the preparations around that and the specificity of that, but also small daily household kind of rituals. Like she describes late in the book, she describes there being a particular, not even a set, but a fragmented set of spode china. It's like, 4 cups and 3 plates or something that had belonged to a member of her husband's family and were for some reason in the house, and she would only eat off those dishes. And if they were dirty, she would wash those and only use those. And it's clearly nuts, right? And she's telling us about it like we know it's crazy, but it's part of the rituals. And of course, the places we see rituals, are things like weddings, funerals, these kinds of commemorations that we do together to mark the passage of some important momentous life event, and also in children's play.
Yeah.
Children's play is full of ritual.
Oh, very ritualistic.
Right.
But I mean, even day-to-day adult life, I don't know if everyone's like this, but there are little rituals that you do. You have to, as you're going out the door, you have to touch this object by the door to ensure good fortune, And it's silly, but you still touch the little thing.
Yeah, like that magic is everywhere, right? And that's a kind of magical thinking, right? That we, to greater or lesser extents, that are part of our lives, like how we hold it all together.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I think this book is really interesting, because it's like, in a way, it's about bereavement and the grief that happens, but it's also about how we hold everything together through magical thinking. And this is, and her year of it is a very intense manifestation of something that is always there, I think, at a really low volume.
Yeah. I mean, I knew this book was about death, and I could tell from the title there was something about magical thinking. I'm very interested to hear more about magical thinking and rituals and so forth, because I don't know about you. Anytime when I'm very anxious about something, I do invent out of thin air all kinds of rituals which will somehow make things better. And they're completely irrational, but it's sort of like the willingness to believe that there is a secret order to the universe and that every action reverberates outward from itself in meaningful ways, which may restructure reality. The belief in that shoots up about 5,000% in times of stress.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I don't think that's crazy. At least I don't think that's crazy in a bad way. Like, I think that's what we do as human beings. Like, when we talk about being grounded and centering yourself and being able to function in the world in a good way that's good for your own physical and mental health, but also good for those around you, and even allows you to contribute, to the wider world, right? And in whatever corner each of us is in, right? Like, that's a very real thing. And we need those ways of being grounded, of feeling that we're in the right place at the right time and doing what we need to do, right? But under tremendous pressure, we get magical thinking in its kind of like turned up to maximum volume kind of. And that's what and like I said, that's one of the things that's neat about this book, because it shows us what that looks like, but indirectly it casts a little bit of an indirect light on what we do all the time. Here's an example that shows up relatively early in the book. She says, "Of course, I knew John was dead. Yet I was myself in no way prepared to accept this news as final. There was a level on which I believed that what had happened remained reversible. That is why I needed to be alone." Because she's describing how she wanted to sleep alone at the apartment that first night. And everybody's like, "Are you sure you're okay?" And she's like, "Yes, absolutely." So she said, "That's why I needed to be alone. I needed to be alone so that he could come back." This was the beginning of my year of magical thinking. And so she comes back to this kind of magical thinking at different moments. Like, there's one where she's gathering his clothes to donate. And so this is, again, something that I think people who have experienced a bereavement often talk about as either something that's unbearably difficult to do, and so they put it off, or in some cases, it's so unbearable to have the person's belongings there that they do it right away. So I think this is like a very charged spot. So she gathers up the clothes to donate, and then she says, "I stopped at the door to the room. I could not give away the rest of his shoes. I stood there for a moment, then realized why. He would need shoes if he was to return. The recognition of this thought by no means eradicated the thought. I have still not tried to determine, say, by giving away the shoes, if the thought has lost its power." And she writes each of these as a separate paragraph, each sentence, right? I stopped at the door to the room. I could not give away the rest of his shoes. I stood there a moment, then realized why. And so, like, on the one hand, she's got this thought that if I keep the shoes, he'll come back. If I get rid of them, he won't have any shoes.
Yeah.
And then at the same time in her mind, she's like, and that's crazy. but they're both there.
Yeah. The self-awareness that this is irrational, but also the self-compassion to allow yourself that irrationality.
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt anyone to hold on to those shoes. And why not?
Yeah. And you're right about it being compassionate because, I read those two passages about grief, one at the beginning of the book and one at the end. And I didn't read the last couple of words of the second passage, which is close to the end of the book, where she says, "We do not expect to be literally crazy, cool customers who believe that their husband is about to return and need his shoes." Right. So she comes back to this point, like repeatedly as like the shoes being kind of like this, almost like the emblem of the moment where it's crazy that you're doing this, but you have to do this because this is the only way you can get through.
Yeah. Like there's this whisper thin strand of hope, which is completely insane, but you're holding on to it.
Because if you don't.
Yeah. And if you get rid of the shoes and that's the reason why he doesn't come back.
Yeah.
Unthinkable. It can't be your fault that he doesn't come back. That would be horrible. So you need to hold on to the shoes just in case.
Yeah, no, it's and it's interesting how you pointed out that kind of like gentleness, like that almost kind of like you must be patient with yourself kind of aspect, because I wasn't aware of that consciously, but you're absolutely right. It shows up again and again. There's a passage quite near the end of the book where I kind of think of as a passage about noticing. And so she's describing her own behaviors. And so she'll say, "I notice that I have lost the skills for ordinary social encounters." And then it goes on for a while. And then she says, "I notice that I get up from dinner too abruptly." And then she says, "I also notice that I do not have the resilience I had a year ago." Like, so she's just noticing, like, it's very meditative almost. Do you know what I mean? Like, so she's, performing the crazy, performing the ritual, doing all the things she has to do to get through. And she's also watching. And I guess it's that journalism thing that I was talking about earlier in her other work, right? That she can be immersed in what's happening to her. And yet this other part of her head is watching and being like, "Oh, that's what's happening."
I mean, that is the journalistic trick.
Yeah, but like in a time like that, it's incredible to imagine, right?
Much of the sort of great works of nonfiction are people who have had extraordinary experiences who are able to self-report in that they're both emotionally in it, and yet there's a recording higher self who is able to record somewhat dispassionately at the same time as they're fully emotionally in it. And it's a great trick. It's something, indicates that she's a very good writer. Shock, newsflash, hot take, Joan Didion, good at writing.
She's beautiful prose, I have to say. I mean, just at the level of the sentence, I think the sentences are like incredibly good.
Yeah. This goes right back, way, way back to when you were introducing her, and you said that she was sometimes accused of being narcissistic in her writing. I mean, I don't want us to get fully sidetracked here. That feels to me like a very gendered criticism.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I think you're right. There's so much to say about that. I think you are right. It's interesting, I guess, in this book because it is, I guess you could say, sure, it's narcissistic in the sense that she's talking about herself, but the reason she is like that's the only way you can narrate this, because it's about what it is to experience loss, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with talking about yourself if you've had something interesting or noteworthy happen to you.
Yeah. And one of the things that's kind of neat about the style, we were just talking about the level of the sentence, and they're very simple and clear, and like her sentences are just the right length. She doesn't use hardly any commas. I was reminded of Gertrude Stein, who always says you should not need to use commas, because Joan Didion clearly had absorbed this. She hardly ever uses commas, and the sentences just work. They're just they're simple, but they're not reductively simple. They're really beautiful sentences. And I think it's partly that style that lets her do sometimes very complicated and weird things. I gotta put it in the prose, like to express something that's very difficult to put into words. She's able to do it because she's got this deceptively lucid prose style. So I mentioned, I noticed this especially in a section where she's talking about her daughter's illness and hospitalization. So you remember I sort of mentioned that there's two, I guess, sites of grief kind of in this book. One is the daughter's illness and hospitalization, and one is her husband's death. And they're almost like mapped right onto one another. When the book opens, she's narrating how she and her husband had been to visit their daughter in the intensive care unit. And then they come home, and then that's when her husband has the massive heart attack and dies, right? And she has to continue to visit her daughter in the hospital, and in fact delays the memorial service until the daughter is well enough 3 months later to come out and come to the memorial service. And then there's additional periods of hospitalization, and the daughter's illness permeates the whole book, not just throughout the year of magical thinking, but also in a very intense way in the period of writing between October and December. So there's like these two, like there's this diffuse grief that's drawn out over time. And then there's this other grief that's sudden and abrupt. And they're really interwoven in this incredibly complex way in the book. And there's this one moment where I think that complexity becomes really visible. So it's a chapter, I don't know, it's like maybe 5 chapters in or so, where she's reconstructing the timeline of her daughter's illness. So just sort of narrating what happened first, what happened second, then what happened third. She started telling that story. And there's a scene that she describes when she and her husband are at the intensive care unit, so before his death, and they're talking to one of the doctors. She says this: "On our way out of the ICU, we managed to maneuver a doctor into talking to us. We asked if the decrease in delivered oxygen meant that she was getting better. There was a pause. This was when the ICU doctor said it. Quote, 'We're still not sure which way this is going.' The way this is going is up," I remember thinking. The ICU doctor was still talking. "She's really very sick," he was saying. I recognized this as a coded way of saying that she was expected to die, but I persisted. The way this is going is up. It's going up because it has to go up. I believe in Cat. I believe in God. Right? And those are all in italics, like that's her own thoughts. And then the next words, "I love you more than one more day," Quintana said 3 months later, standing in the black dress at St. John the Divine, "as you used to say to me." And then there's a little line break, and then it says, "We were married on the afternoon of January 30th, 1964, Thursday, at the Catholic Mission of San Juan Bautista." So this is really weird, complex time schema happening here. She's describing how she and her husband are at the ICU. They talk to the doctor. The doctor says, "We're not sure, which way this is going." And she's already got the magical thinking going, right? The way this is going is up. Like that's the hopefulness, right? She's going to get better. It's going to work. And then she doesn't say, "Oh, things got better," or whatever. She then goes right from her own magical thinking to her daughter speaking to her to say, "I love you more than one more day." 3 months later, standing at the funeral service, right? At St. John the Divine. And so it's a kind of proof that magical thinking works. She thought magically, and there Quintana, her daughter, was standing next to her at her father's funeral. And that moment in time, 3 months later, is also connected to a whole bunch of earlier moments in time because Quintana says, "as you used to say to me," right? So she's repeating something that her mother used to say to her in the before time. And then the next sentence, "we were married at the Catholic Mission at San Juan Bautista in 1964, is like juxtaposing the moment at the funeral at St. John the Divine with the marriage in 1964 at San Juan Bautista. So there's like all the times are gathered together in this like clump. And I think that really limpid prose style is facilitates that, makes that kind of work. There's almost like these little juxtapositions, one thing next to the other.
Yeah. I mean, it's very the way that human thoughts work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like our thoughts don't follow a simple chronology. They jump over events. They go backwards and forwards. They draw connections based on themes, images, mysterious things.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And of course, that's also the way ritual works, right? Like ritual is a way of connecting for us the moment we're in right now with one or more other like sacred moments, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore bringing us outside of linear time into something else.
And like the idea of that magical thinking creating a moment in the future, which you will then jump to.
Exactly. It's kind of beautiful.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's very relatable. I mean, in addition to dealing with, death, I think most people have dealt with serious illness or injury of a loved one, and that not knowing which way it's going to go is terrible. And you do all kinds of bargaining with the universe. If I do X, please make my loved one be okay. I promise I'll do Y if you just save my loved one, Yeah. Woof.
So it's it's in some ways kind of a heavy book, but I feel like it's a very beautiful book.
Yeah.
And it can be really wonderful to read if you're thinking about those things anyway, or feeling some of those things. I feel like it's a really good book to read to kind of not be alone in that experience.
Editing Michael here, just dropping in a little content warning. The following discussion touches on some real-world serial killings and sexual violence and gruesome type things like that. So if that is something that you don't feel up to listening to right now, you can skip on to the catching up session towards the end. Thanks so much, and take care of yourself. There are frightening things in the world, things that hunt by instinct, that watch and stalk and corner and seize and shake us to death, fling our remains where they may never be found, and then, in the next breath, rush to their masters for a gentle pat on the head. In that one raw moment, we can just unexist, as if the earth, or something inside the earth, has opened its maw and devoured us whole. So, Red X.
Scary.
Yes, well, this is a horror novel. This is a queer horror novel. I would call it a folkloric queer horror novel. And that first adjective I really went over as like, is it a supernatural? And I think that gives the wrong idea. Is it magical realism? It certainly has strong elements of that, but I feel like that's a fairly freighted term nowadays. And so I'm going to go with folkloric, but any of those three could suffice. It's by David Demchuk, who is he now lives in St. John's, Newfoundland, but he lived for a long, long time in Toronto, and this is a book about Toronto specifically. And it is about, even more specific than that, the way that queer people in general, and specifically gay men, have disappeared in this city over the years. And it's an intertextual sort of response to, I suppose. I don't know if you listeners are aware that there was a serial killer operating in Toronto's gay village for many, many years with many, many victims. And
I actually had heard about this when I first moved to Toronto in 95, because it wasn't that long in the past, right?
Oh, I mean, he was only caught because he tended to target closeted men, gay men from marginal communities, people of color, and he made the mistake of having one of his victims be a white guy whose family missed him and went looking for him, and that's how he was caught. But I think he had 16 victims. And they're spread out over years. He was I don't know how gruesome to get here. This is all included in the book. I've already gone off script, but the remains were buried in rich people's gardens up in Rosedale, in one of the nice neighborhoods in Toronto, because the serial killer, that was his day job. He was a landscaper.
Oh my gosh.
So lots of rich people were having their gardens dug up to find human remains of the victims of this killer. This book is not about him. This is not the person or the entity, I suppose, who claims the men over the course of this book is supernatural, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let's talk about the book more generally. So it's moves in discrete segments from 1984 to 2016, and there are new characters. We meet the victims as they are sort of devoured by the supernatural entity, but we get to know them before they slip away and disappear and are never seen again. And it's always a disappearance into some sort of other reality. These men are not just killed, they are kind of unmade. They are claimed by this creature, this supernatural monster. But there are characters who do persist through segments, so it's not entirely disorienting. There's a black lesbian DJ and her trans femme girlfriend. I think they got married by the end, for instance, who are in every segment. So you do have these touchstones to anchor you and to reorient yourself every time there's a new jump forward in time. And between these fictional segments, there are nonfiction bits by the author himself about his own experience, like coming to Toronto, basically at the very moment when the CDC in Atlanta identified AIDS, and then living in Toronto in the 80s and the 90s and the O's and the teens, and what it was like to be part of that community. And he talks about both his life growing up in rural Manitoba, but also about knowing some of the victims of the serial killer that we talked about at the start of this discussion.
Yeah.
So it really sort of serves to bring the more fantastical supernatural elements of the book and weave them into like real grounded Toronto.
Yeah, it brings out something you were mentioning earlier. You said that the book is about the disappearance of gay men. And so that plays out in more than one way from what you're saying, like the supernatural, deaths that are taking place, but also the AIDS epidemic that's taking place, and also maybe social changes that are part of what's happening too.
Yeah, it does a really, really great job taking in that whole social milieu of like what it is to be queer, for the catch-allness of the term, queer mask, I suppose more specifically, but there are no doors shut here. It's just the author writing through his experience, and he is a gay man. But like what it is, what the cultural milieu of Toronto is, and it does a wonderful job in terms of creating Toronto as this sort of a crude tissue of violence and exploitation and it's almost archaeological. The entity who is at the center of this consuming of gay life is himself a gay boy from the 1700s, let's say, but sort of transformed via fairy magic and trauma into this kind of both consuming and avenging figure. When he marks someone as his, this little red leather notebook appears near them, and they write something for him. They write a poem, or they draw a picture in there, and they carry it around with them. And it is like a cursed object, like a fairy object. The people around them can see them, sort of the vitality being sapped from them, and then they disappear.
Ooh. I can see why you say it's folkloric.
Oh, it absolutely is. I mean, this is sort of his book of shades, and all of the victims that he's gathered over hundreds of years are represented there by these multilingual snippets of prose and poetry and art. And it's beautiful, and it's macabre, and it's very, very powerful. And anytime he marks someone, the book appears, and once you found the book, it's kind of your fate is sealed. There's no escaping. He is coming for you, and he will claim you. What
do you make of the, I don't want to say symbolism exactly of the book, but what is bookishness doing in this book? Why is it that?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know if I have a great answer for you. I mean, it makes me think about how for a long, 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 long time, and I'm in my 40s, which means I'm old enough to remember that, coming up as a gay teenager, it was being gay is a death sentence. That's going to kill you. Whether you're going to be beaten to death or you're going to get AIDS and die. One of those things is you're not going to be an old man. Gay boys don't get to become old men, was what I sort of absorbed in the 90s as a teenager. And that's not new. That's not an AIDS thing. That's going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So there's this idea, the entity who owns this book is a beautiful young man who sometimes is a wolf and sometimes is a bear and sometimes is a fairy prince, a barghest, if that word means anything to you, the sort of dire wolf type figure. Yeah. Very, very furry coated in a sense, very werewolf. But he loves, his foundational trauma was being tortured to death for being a gay, and there's something about the doomedness. Oh, you've fallen in love with this beautiful man, you're doomed.
Is his life bound up with the sort of cityscape of Toronto? In other words, is he supposed to have lived and died?
Yeah.
There? Yeah.
Yes. So there's, do you remember when you lived here, there used to be a statue on the corner of, I think it was Church and Alexander Street of Alexander Wood?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's, so that was his master. It's not him. Ah. It was a servant in his employ.
Wow.
So this is a historical figure in 1810s Toronto, I want to say, and he was there were rumors he was a lifelong bachelor, and he had basically a woman had claimed that she had been sexually assaulted, and she had managed to scratch the genitalia of her assailant, and so he the story goes, used this as an excuse to examine the genitals of all the soldiers and all the handsome young men nearby, and this caused a scandal, and I don't want to be too concrete in my answers because the book itself is very loose and very slippery.
Right.
And I feel like it's gossamer and kind of foggy. And if I sort of were to close my hands around a definite answer, I don't know if I would be able to grasp it. And also I feel like it would do a disservice to what the book is.
Yeah, well, and you were saying too that there's a careful kind of calibration of like the fictional folkloric parts and then these nonfiction sections, right? So he's clearly wanting us to be kind of between those worlds, right? That
Yes.
nonfiction experience of the city
Absolutely.
itself and then this other thing.
Yeah, and so the interstitial parts, which are nonfiction from David's own personal life, telling us about his uncle who he adored, who died tragically in a car accident when he was like in his early 30s, and talking about the dog that he was walking and that managed to get away from him and murder a neighbor's pet rabbit. These sort of like little anecdotes from his life, and so when you get towards the end and you realize that these two worlds are actually colliding and starting to weave together, and that sort of decenters and destabilizes everything. And I would have really, really enjoyed this book, and I would strongly recommend it to anyone who enjoys queer horror or this sort of folkloric, supernatural, magical, realist history. You do need to have a strong stomach. There's a lot of sexual violence. There's a lot of real nasty stuff in here. But point being, I would recommend it. David Demchuk is also a good friend of mine. He was a guest on my old podcast, This Is Your Mixtape, one of my favorite episodes. Really great episode. We'll link it into the show notes. And when he moved to Newfoundland, where I'm originally from, I gave him a lot of like sort of help and advice and getting him set up there and everything.
It was not a part of the world that he already knew?
No. I don't know if I can accurately explain why he moved to Newfoundland, other than I think he likes how gothic it is.
Yeah.
But point being, that was one of the reasons why when your friends publish a novel, you really want to read it. And the fact that my sort of intellectual scarring around reading meant that I had this on my shelf for years, this book by a good friend that I knew I would really like, and I could not seem to bring myself to crack it open, was really a pain point for me. So I was really glad to have this. The Spouter-Inn was 50% of my excuse for getting going on that.
Are there any passages that you especially love or would want to read?
I guess because, spoiler alert, I already indicated that the nonfiction elements and the fiction elements begin to weave together. I'll read this. So this is when, in the nonfiction elements, David is talking about being sort of hunted and haunted. Hunted and haunted, just to make sure I got both those words there. And then he basically encounters this devouring entity that has been behind all of these disappearances in Toronto over the years. Then I sensed I was not alone. With me in the chamber in the farthest corner, a figure sat cross-legged on the floor. He cradled in his lap a speckled enamel bowl, and in it was a jumble of glistening organs and meat-covered bones, raw and red and wet. He held up one of the bones, a slender curve of modest size that might have been a rib, and tore at the flesh with his teeth. He looked up and into my eyes. His face seemed to move and shift and change from human to canine to something even more monstrous. I know who you are, I said. I had imagined this boy, but not this boy. This was not a boy at all, not anything human. His nose and mouth were strange, misshapen, sometimes more of a snout, changing from moment to moment, and the whole of his jaw and neck and chest were soaked with clotting blood. And I know who you are, the creature replied. The book has wound you in its web and drawn you here to me. He waved me over with his furry hand and gestured to a place across from him. Come, sit with me. Make this a quiet interlude in your night journey. I shall share my tale with you. I know how you love stories.
That's a neat passage.
Yeah.
I'm really enchanted by the furry hand, and like he's compared in the opening to a dog. Like, because you mentioned earlier too, like I think wolves and bears. Like, what are animal natures doing in this story?
Yeah. Well, there's a few dogs in this story, and some of them meet fairly grisly ends. I think there's a few things going on here. I think it's to do with kind of an intertextual play with the fact that gay men are oftentimes represented as sort of animalistic or bestial.
Bears and cubs. And this and that.
And like, but we do it to ourselves, like in a playful, like sex positive kind of way.
Yeah.
And then the entirety of furry subculture, which is like way more common of a thing. There's so many aspects of gay life you don't tell your mother about. It's like, yes, mother, we pretend to be wolves together when we're having sex. It's normal where I come from. Like, it's the sorts of things which like are so far outside the bonds of like heterosexual propriety, and these are sort of also, however, insults that have been sort of thrown at us. You know, the idea that giving into gay lust is to be bestial, is to be animalistic, and that there is something degrading about homosexuality that does take your humanity away from you. And so the fact that this creature is both human and not human, animal and something else. He seems to have some sort of tie to the fairy realm of Celtic folklore as well, but is not necessarily of that either. The Everwoods are a thing, and there's a lot of like Celtic myth woven in here as well. The boy who he used to be was Scottish originally, so that might be that. But yeah, no, there's so much going on.
Yeah, that comes out, what you were just describing comes out also in that passage you read at the very beginning, where it's describing frightening things in this world that, you know, do all these things, these bad things, right? These dangerous things. And then in the next breath, rush to their masters for a gentle pat on the head, which like to my mind was like, it made me see kind of, I don't know, either the feral dog or wolf on the one hand, and then the obedient you know, domestic animal on the other, right? And I guess it's that sort of binary, right? That's the source of terror here, right? There's like, it's terror, but also maybe something liberating at the same time, right? That a thing can be wild or a thing can be domestic.
And like this is a very morally complicated book, and there's not a clear bad guy. It's not like the villain is like some sort of conservative Christian who says being gay is bad. It's like, no, it's far more complicated.
Yeah, he's a
than
victim
that.
too, right?
He is a victim too, and like it makes me think about how to be a gay man specifically. And I've used queer and I've used catch-all terms here. In this case, I am talking specifically about masculinity. To be a gay man is to be both the wielder of and the subject to sexual violence, you know, and though there are ways to contain that and channel that into ways which are consensual and fun and so forth, but like there is something in this book, and I think in a lot of depictions thereof, of male sexuality as something with an edge of danger and violence to it, and when you are sort of like on a two-way street with that, you realize that you are both the victim and the monster at the same time.
Yeah.
And within the context of a horror story with supernatural elements that manifests in these really fascinating ways.
Yeah. So that's so interesting. It makes me curious. Like you talked earlier about wanting to read this book for a long time. It's by a friend. It's been on your shelf. But then how can I put it? Are there ways in which you're activating your reading? Like, is it connecting to things that you're involved with today? Or like,
yes.
you know, like in other words, is the book actual for you in some ways?
Oh, it absolutely is. So I was going to bring this up when I said that the Spouter-Inn was 50% of the reason for getting me going on this. The other 50% is, and this, I want to talk about this. I'm really excited to talk about this for a few minutes. I am preparing a Vampire the Masquerade chronicle set in Toronto, and David Demchuk, author of Red X, is going to be one of my players. So I partially read this as preparation for that, because the setting is Toronto. Vampire the Masquerade is a game of personal horror, and someone who has written a supernatural horror story set in Toronto is going to be playing in the game. I really ought to read that book.
Yeah.
And I'm super looking forward to it because this was extremely useful to me. And I just want to talk about, are you familiar with Vampire the Masquerade? Do you know what that is?
No, I'm really curious to hear about it though.
Okay. So Vampire the Masquerade. So Vampire the Masquerade is a tabletop role-playing game. And the one that everyone should know is Dungeons and Dragons. That's a tabletop role-playing game. And I get the feeling that it's become much more popular since the pandemic, and people probably have an idea of it. But Dungeons and Dragons is a much more sort of high fantasy, like fighting, swinging swords, that sort of thing. And I don't want to denigrate that. You can tell wonderful stories.
But there's other worlds.
Oh, there are other worlds. You can tell a wonderful story. Like Lord of the Rings is a great story. You can tell a great story that has like swords and dragons and dwarves and whatnot. Vampire the Masquerade is set in a version of the real world where vampires are real and everything is about 30 to 40% worse.
Oh my gosh.
And it's meant to be a game of personal horror, so there's far less fighting. Dungeons and Dragons was originally a war game, and you can tell that underneath all the various coats of paint, that's what it is. Vampire the Masquerade is more of a social game.
Was it invented like a long time ago? Or was
It's from the early 90s. For people who are into tabletop role-playing games, there are so many different TTRPGs. Vampire the Masquerade was very popular in the 90s. It might still come in second place in terms of how popular and how common it is. It's probably fallen a bit by the wayside. It's for old goths like me. But point being, I'm really, really interested in tabletop role-playing games in general as a literary form, because I'm thinking back to my time in the academy and like it was completely not even on the radar. But what it is like as a storyteller, or dungeon master if you're doing D&D, but Vampire the Masquerade has storytellers, different name for a very similar role. You're creating scenario and you're creating a world and you're populating it with what we call non-player characters, who are sort of like people you've invented for your players to bump into and interact against. And all of your players will create a character with a good backstory. Give me some good character hooks. What's your trauma? What's the worst thing that ever happened to you? What are your hopes and dreams? What are your personality traits? What's one thing that will make you fly into a rage? All that stuff. Build a character for me. And then you get together with all these people who have done that work with the world that you've built for them. And like the watchmaker, you kind of hit go and adults get together and they play make-believe together.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it sounds like all the best things about childhood.
Absolutely, because those were myself and my brother, we used to play like the Brontes. We had made-up worlds with made-up characters and we would inhabit those characters, and then you fall out of that when you become a teenager because I don't know, like a sense of shame that's childish or something comes in. But like it's so wonderful to have all of these. Many of my players are really great writers and they're very creative people. Many of them are really great actors because this is kind of in a Venn diagram where literature and theater overlap.
I was just going to say there's a performance element to it as well, right? Because you're like performing for one another.
Yeah, and there are what they call actual plays where you can watch like professional actors like play a role-playing game, and like things like Critical Role or Dimension 20, and millions of people watch these things. They're very big, actually. But most of this is what I would call coterie based. Like the game that I'm playing, it's part of a small network of friends and acquaintances. And I ran one called The Albatross, which was set in Gander Airport in the 1960s last year. And I had so much fun. That was my first time running a game. I've played in a bunch of these. It was my first time being the person running it. And it was so much fun, but it's so liberating to sort of inhabit these stories, and it's collaborative storytelling. You often think about like oral storytelling being probably the oldest literary tradition that the human race has,
and still very vital.
Very vital indeed. Right? When and you would be able to speak to this, because when I think of oral storytelling, and Newfoundland has Newfoundland has oral storytelling. I've gone to like the folk festival and sat down and listened to our storytellers, but it is very much like the elder is telling a story and we will sit down and listen. Whereas this is collaborative oral storytelling where each person is a character and you speak in character and you react and you take actions based on what your character would think and what your character would do. And the storyteller is the one who can shape and direct the play and the flow of the narrative, and they can stick their oar in to change the direction, or they can bring a scene to a close and they can instantiate a new scene. But their authority is worn very lightly. The storyteller is not the one telling the story. They are kind of the one facilitating the people within the story to tell the story.
Well, this is amazing. Now, I know during the pandemic, people were playing like online because people couldn't really get together in person, but are these also played in person as well?
Yeah, they're both. They are played online and in person, and they have something called live action role play, which is where you're up and you're walking around, you're wearing a costume, and you're fully like pretending to be your character during the playtime within the play space. And like it has something. It's kind of adjacent to some BDSM practices here, where there are rules about safety, what is and is not allowed, and ways that you can call a stop to the action to suspend the fiction and return to reality if something's happening. Yeah. But mostly these are played either sitting around a table where you're just sort of acting with your voice in your face, or online. And what we do it on a Discord server. We basically all get on the equivalent of a Zoom call. And that makes it easy to play with people who are geographically disparate. Like, I have players in Rochester, I have players in Timmins, Ontario. So, it's very difficult to bring those people physically together.
It's great to be able to do it like online together, but I wonder if there's something that's added or something different to the experience even if it's just in a room where you're around a table, like
absolutely.
that you could eat a meal together, or
absolutely.
you could read body language. Like, I wonder how that's different.
For one thing, crosstalk is very difficult on digital media, so you can't have a crowd all talking at the same time, of course. But no, you're absolutely right. Being in the physical space, there's something magical about that. There was a Werewolf the Apocalypse, which is a sister game to Vampire the Masquerade. My friend Wes ran a story in that, and it was one of the best stories I've ever been in. And the finale, we were able to fly the furthest away player in from Alabama to Rochester. The rest of us drove into Rochester, and we spent the entire day doing the finale of the story, the big emotionally fraught climax of the story. And I can remember I was begging for my infant son's life in front of the coyote god who wanted to kill it. And my eyes, yeah, it happens. My eyes were closed, and I was pouring it out, giving it my all.
Wow.
And when I opened my eyes, Wes, the storyteller, who was playing the deity who is going to decide whether my plea is accepted or whether my infant son will be sacrificed, has this prop sword out, pointed into my throat. I didn't realize because my eyes were closed the entire time. I mean, it's a plastic sword, it's not going to hurt me, but oh my god, I open my eyes and there's a sword right at my throat.
Oh my gosh. That sounds amazing.
So good. Yeah.
So for the Vampire the Masquerade game that you're going to be running pretty soon, do you think that this book is going to enter into it in any kind of way, or get reflected in any kind of way?
Absolutely. I'm both really, really pleased because, frankly, the entity in this book who consumes the gay men is so close to what vampires look like in this game and how they act, and vampires used to be people, and vampires had something within the story. Vampires had something very traumatic happen to them, and they're cursed with immortality, and they're cursed with a thirst for human flesh and blood. But they are still also remnants and vestiges of the people they used to be, and they still think and feel in that way, even as they have these urges to consume. And it's so close, and I'm like, oh my goodness, David, this could be a Vampire the Masquerade story in and of itself, with just a few small tweaks. And I say that as a good thing, as a compliment. To me, that speaks to the personal horror, because the point of, I feel, this book, with the nonfiction interstitials, it feels like a very personal horror. Yeah. Like the section that I almost read at the start. Let me just pull it up here. So he's talking about how the onset of AIDS changed everything. So many were closeted in one part of their lives or another, or had families who were angry or ashamed. You wouldn't see an obituary. You wouldn't hear of a funeral. It's still hard to know what happened to some of the men I slept with, dated, loved. I've searched online for a few of them by name, by city, by age, by school, by occupation, often without success. Those who died before they could be immortalized by search engines and social networks, it's as if they never existed. Yet even now, though our every footstep is tracked and traced by 1,000 unblinking eyes, our every stripe is swiped and every chip is checked, as every search and view and click is absorbed into our history, we still can slip from sight, simply cease to be. Those who watch over us can rewind and review, zoom and freeze, can lean in, pressing their 1,000 faces to 1,000 screens and observe the precise moment when light is swallowed by shadow, when sound is deadened by silence, when someone curls like paper touched by a flame and reaches and blackens and crumbles into ash, into dust. But if they watch, what will they see, and what will they do? This may not be the story you expected. These fears, these horrors may not be the ones you thought you'd face as you begin to turn these pages. For that I apologize, though I hope you'll stay with me. You see, a friend of mine is gone, and I'm afraid, and I'm not sure what else I can do.
Wow.
Yeah, sorry. I considered reading that at the start, and I was like, I don't think I'm going to be able to get through that without breaking a little bit.
Yeah.
A friend of mine is gone, and I'm afraid, and I'm not sure what else I can do. Oh.
It gives you like such a strong like feeling of apprehensiveness and like anxiety, right?
Like the idea that what horrifies us, what frightens us is kind of deeply personal.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what I sort of hope my little shared storytelling experience when I set up this vampire game will do. And that's very much what this book does. This is a very, very personal horror. This is a disturbing book, but like you are being invited into, a very personal experience when you read it.
Yeah, it's like inviting you to participate in the emotion. I'm so struck by, earlier we were talking about grief and the physical nature of grief, how it's not just this intellectual thing. It's like it's a thing that happens to your body. And here too, I don't know if you want to call it horror or what it is, but there's something that just like shakes you in your bones, right?
So I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk about that and to hear some more about Joan Didion. Looking forward, I have a copy. I should crack that open. But what is exciting that's coming down the bend for you?
Oh, that's a hard thing to answer. I also love talking together. That's been really fun. Of course, we miss Chris. We love Chris, but also this is really fun. I've been really preoccupied actually with trying to get organized for some summer research trips that are coming up, and I'll share some of that as that goes on. But the other thing I've been doing has been kind of very household-oriented work. My son, John, moved out to LA a couple of weeks ago. I don't even know if I got a chance to tell you guys. And, he graduated from college last year, and it's not easy finding your first job in this particular world we're living in right now, but he got one. So he moved out to LA. He's working in a little production house out there. And so helping him get organized and, arrange his flight and help him get, apartment and all that stuff and, set up life out there has been really all encompassing and all preoccupying for all. So I'm going to go out there to visit him in a couple of weeks' time, which I'm really looking forward to.
That's so exciting.
Yeah.
That's good.
I'll send pictures.
Please do. Because I can remember the last time we spoke, there was some anxiety, and I was like, man, I would not want to be a college graduate in 2026.
Yeah, it's a hard time, right?
I'm so happy to hear that he's got something, and it sounds something exciting. Like there's something great to be in your early 20s and be starting in a new city. Maybe it's rose-colored glasses.
I know. Don't tell him that. He's all like anxious and like, oh God, everything is terrible.
Of course he's anxious. Of course he's anxious.
Such a great time.
I mean, it's only exciting in hindsight, right?
I know. That's exactly right. Exactly. It reminds me of this one time when like my first daughter was really small and I was at my in-laws' house and she was like yelling or something. And it's like, I was just miserable. And my mother-in-law says, you're going to look back on this as the happiest time in your life. and I remember, of course, I didn't say anything, but in my mind, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. So I think it's often like that.
I don't think it's helpful to tell someone who's having a hard time that this is the pinnacle of your life. It's never going to get any better than this. That's not something you want to hear.
I mean, it all worked out, but
incredible.
But so what have you been up to? What other things are going on, or what are you looking forward to other than the game, which is going to be incredible?
Yeah, I was going to say, so I'm starting that in late June, so I got to do a lot of work. There's a lot of work in fleshing out my fictional version of Toronto, so that's going to take up a bunch of time. But I am preparing for my grade 10 Royal Conservatory of Music piano practical exam.
Oh, wonderful.
So that's on like the 4th of June, I want to say, early June.
And you've been dedicating yourself to like piano study for, I know it was early in life, but recently it's been a few years now, right?
Yeah. I feel like it's not that uncommon of a thing, but, uncommon enough. I was, basically, I grew up in rural Newfoundland, and I want to say I was like a child prodigy. I guess I was, but it's really hard to tell when you're in such an area that has such limited resources.
And also, you can't judge your own.
No, but I progressed very, very rapidly. And then when I sort of reached my teens, I sort of decided I didn't want to pursue music school. I didn't want to get a music degree. I didn't want to be a music teacher. I didn't think I was good enough to become a concert pianist, because that's kind of like moving to Hollywood expecting to become like a Hollywood actor. Like it could happen, but it's a very flimsy basket to put your eggs in. So I figured I was good enough to do anything I ever would want to do. So I sort of like laid off. And then in my 20s and 30s, I often didn't have access to a piano. And when I did, I would only play it sort of sporadically. And then when I was about 39, I didn't know what to ask my parents for Christmas. They wanted to get me something for Christmas. Like, I don't know what you can get me for Christmas. And then I thought, I live in Toronto, where the Royal Conservatoire of Music is. Get me piano lessons. So I've been having piano lessons for Christmas for a few years, and I got to grade 9 when I was a teenager in the Royal Conservatoire of Music. Grade 10 is their top grade. After that, it's advanced repertoire. So I'm now surpassed where I was at my teenage peak, and
Wow.
I'm super. For the first time about a week ago, I sort of did my practice. I ran through my program, which is about a half hour of music, and I thought to myself, I might do okay.
Oh, I'm sure you're going to be great.
Well, I mean, the thing is, this is only for my own personal satisfaction. I'm not trying to get into a music school.
That is the best reason to do anything.
Yeah. So it's like whatever I end up doing, if I fail, if I pass with honors, if I pass with distinction, it's all fine. Nothing is riding on this. The consequences are my pride. That's it.
Oh.
And so I'm trying to stay a little bit calm about it.
Yeah. Oh no, you're doing it for the best of reasons. That's terrific.
But I get to do Wedding Day by Trollhagen by Edvard Grieg for my List C piece, and that's the music that Chris and I walked to in our wedding. And I'm doing an Oscar Peterson piece for my List E, which is the contemporary / jazz, and Dad really likes Oscar Peterson, so that one's kind of for my dad. So I've assembled a program which feels very personal.
Yeah, I love that. That's beautiful. So this has been so great talking together. I'm already looking forward to our next time together.
Yeah.
And listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We'd love to hear from you. This show is made possible by people like you supporting us on Patreon, and patrons get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord. Find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/92. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
See you again at the Spouter-Inn.